1865 to 1877. These are our core objectives. Please make sure that you review these as you're reading the chapter so that you make sure you understand all the concepts in the chapter. Reconstruction. Reconstruction is the time period from 1865 to 1876. This is what we usually call the broad definition of Reconstruction. And this is usually the way that we see the term Reconstruction used, just looking at the time frame or the era of history. But Reconstruction also has a more narrow definition, and that is the process by which the Southern states and Southerners were restored their rights in the Union. And in this chapter, we're going to be talking about both the time frame of Reconstruction and the major events and people that are associated with that time frame. But we're also going to be talking about the processes, beginning with Lincoln, going through Johnson's plan, and into the congressional plans for Reconstruction. When we look at the era of Reconstruction in American history, it is one that is greatly debated among historians and the general population. Oftentimes when we look at the histories of Reconstruction that were written in the early 20th century, we see Reconstruction referred to as the tragic era of Reconstruction, looking at all of the failures of Reconstruction and the government issues that we had, the corruption that occurred during the time period, of course, the evolution and beginnings of the Ku Klux Klan. But there are really a lot of myths of Reconstruction. Yes, there were bad things that happened during Reconstruction. There was government corruption. There were bad people that harassed the former slaves and the Northerners that came down from the South. But also when we look at Reconstruction, we have to remember that the Civil War was a loss for the Confederates. And usually when people lose a civil war, there is widespread imprisonments or executions of those that were involved. And we see that that's not going to happen. We also have to remember, because the South lost the Civil War, it's going to completely disrupt the Southern economy and Southern society. And so when you have changes of the magnitude that we're going to have during Reconstruction, there are going to be growing pains, and there are going to be people who are going to fight back against the changes that have to occur during Reconstruction. So we need to keep an open mind about Reconstruction. I think sometimes as Southerners, we look at Reconstruction with a more negative light, but there are going to be many positive things that come out of Reconstruction. One of the things that we have to look at that is not up for debate is that there really are three principles of Reconstruction. When the federal government was looking at bringing the Southern states back into the Union, they had three principles or three concepts that they demanded from the South. And one, they wanted the South to renounce their doctrine of secession. This is just to say that secession was not legal, that every time the South got mad, they can't just leave the Union. The second principle or concept was they had to free the slaves. The war had been fought in the last 2 years on the concepts of the Emancipation Proclamation. And soon after the war was over, in December of 1865, the 13th Amendment is going to be passed, which ends slavery. And so slavery has to end in the South. And thirdly, the third thing that was demanded was that the South had to replace their pre-war leadership. You can't make comprehensive change in the South if you're going to have the same leaders that you had that led the South into the Civil War. So we're going to see that that pre-war leadership is going to have to be replaced. In looking at punishment for Southern leaders, this was something I was mentioning earlier. Usually when you have a lost revolution or a lost Civil War, as in the South in the Civil War, there are widespread punishments for those who led that rebellion. We are not going to see that in the American Civil War. Robert E. Lee is the best known Southern general coming out of the Civil War. Many credit Robert E. Lee and his military expertise with keeping the South in the war for 4 full years. So if anyone was going to be punished, it probably would have been him. But Robert E. Lee was not imprisoned. Robert E. Lee, after he surrenders to Grant, he will retire to his plantation in Virginia and eventually even serve as the president of a small college in Virginia, never serving any jail time for his actions during the American Civil War. Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy. This is another individual who we would think would be greatly punished for the war. Now, Jefferson Davis was imprisoned for about 2 years before he was released, and then he will retire to one of his homes in Mississippi. We do not see widespread executions and imprisonments of those Southern leaders. There was one Southern officer that was executed after the war, and that was a Major Henry Wirz. But he was executed for committing crimes against humanity. He had been the commander of one of the POW camps where the Union officers and Union soldiers were horribly mistreated and starved. And so he was executed for crimes against humanity. But he was the only Southern leader that received that level of punishment. So when we look at this, we see that while things are not going to be good in the South after the Civil War, and we're going to talk more about that, they could have been much worse. There were not massive imprisonments. There were not massive executions of Southern leadership after the war. Now, the South is going to be in a terrible economic and physical state after the Civil War. Most of the battles of the war have been fought in the South, so there's going to be a great deal of destruction of private property and public property. Many schools, churches, hospitals, government buildings were destroyed, as well as people's homes, farms. So there's going to be total destruction in the South. Most of the southern cities, with the exception of New Orleans, were burned either completely or partially during the war. So there is going to be a lot of physical destruction that's going to have to be dealt with, as well as the massive loss of life that goes along with that. There's going to be economic devastation because of this physical destruction. When you destroyed southern plantations, the farmlands were burned, the cattle were destroyed, then the South is going to have to recover from that. And one of the difficult things for the South is going to be is that the South had built its entire pre-war economy on cotton, King Cotton, they called it. And that entire King Cotton system was built on the foundations of slavery. So when slavery is ended, that it means that the South is going to have to go through a total economic reconstruction. How are you going to still be agricultural, which the South will choose to still be primarily agricultural after the Civil War? How are you going to rebuild that economy? What is your labor system going to be? Are you going to diversify and have other crops? Will you build more industry in the South? So there's going to be a complete economic reconstruction that has to occur, as well as a total social and cultural organization. When we look at the plantation system, it was an economic system, but it was also a social and cultural system. The people that owned the large plantations, that owned the massive amounts of farmland and the hundreds and sometimes thousands of slaves, they were at the top of the social order. They were the people who controlled the government. And so they now lose a huge part of their financial investment when they lose their slaves. Many of them will lose their plantations and their farmlands after the war. And so how are you going to restructure that system socially, culturally? And it's going to be starting completely over, really, for the South. And anytime you have change of that magnitude, people are going to fight back. The South had liked the way that it was. That's why they had seceded from the Union. They did not want change. So now to lose a Civil War and have to change, you can guarantee that there are going to be people that are going to push back on that, and that's why we're going to have a 12-year Reconstruction period for a 4.5-year war. One of the first things that we have to look at during the Reconstruction period is ending slavery. After the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation Act in January of 1863, the ending of slavery became a goal, if not the major goal, of the Union in the Civil War. And so soon after the war was over in April of 1865, Congress sent the 13th Amendment out to the states for ratification. By December of 1865, 3/4 of the states, which was the required number, had ratified the 13th Amendment. But the 13th Amendment did not solve all the problems of the former slaves. The 13th Amendment simply says that slavery and involuntary servitude are ended in the United States. It does not talk about what rights the former slaves will have. It does not grant them citizenship, and so it stops short of completing the ultimate goal of creating equality in the country. It's going to be later, and we're going to talk about these a couple slides from now, with the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, when we see that slaves will actually be granted citizenship rights, voting rights, and begin to have some measure of equality. Immediately after the Civil War, even after the passage of the 13th Amendment, the ultimate goal, or the immediate goal, was to help those former slaves adjust to a new world, a new life. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was created in 1865 to help the former slaves and other displaced people move forward after the Civil War. The chairman or president of the Freedmen's Bureau was Oliver Howard, who was a former general. And the purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to help feed, clothe, find housing for the former slaves, and also to educate them. Of course, the immediate needs were food, clothing, housing, because when the war was over, many of the slaves left the plantations, or what was left of the plantations, seeking a new life. But they had few job skills, other than working in the cotton farms. Most of them were uneducated because it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. So they had to help them find places to live. They had to help them have food and clothing. But one of the big goals of the Freedmen's Bureau was education, because the Bureau understood that without education, the former slaves could never move into new positions beyond being a field hand. So a big goal was education. And really the area that the Freedmen's Bureau was most successful was in education. Many Northerners came down to the South, built what was called freedmen schools that were used to educate not just children, but adult former slaves, teach them reading, writing, basic arithmetic. We're not talking about, arts and sciences. We're talking about fundamental education here so they could take care of themselves and begin to move forward in their lives. The problem with the Freedmen's Bureau was that it was underfunded. This was one of the first civic programs that the federal government came up with. and they did not know the magnitude of need in the South and how much money it would take to feed and clothe and house all of these former slaves and provide education for them. One of the reasons that education was more successful than the other endeavors of the Freedmen's Bureau was because many church groups got involved with sending people to the South to build schools and would provide the teachers for the education. So the Freedmen's Bureau was a very first step of trying to help those former slaves adjust to their new life. When we look at Reconstruction, by early 1865, it was pretty much known by the Union and Abraham Lincoln and his advisors that they were going to win the war. It was a matter of when the South surrendered, not if they surrendered, because the South was on its last legs by 1865. And so before his death, Abraham Lincoln came up with a plan for Reconstruction. And Lincoln's plan is often referred to as the 10% plan. Lincoln believed that the war had caused enough devastation in the Union and had split the country enough. And so his goal with his plan was to bring the country back together as quickly as possible. So the first thing he stated in his plan was that there would be a general amnesty, meaning that no one would, or at least the majority of the people, would be free from prosecution. They would not go to jail for having fought for the Confederacy or having held positions in the Confederate military or government. This, he felt, would help to heal the wounds more quickly than putting people in jail for long periods of time. The way it gets its name, the 10% plan, is that the plan also stated that when 10% of the voters in 1860 pledged an oath of loyalty to the Union, then that state would be brought back into the Union. So you're looking at a very small majority of voters in 1860. You would be looking at really only, a small percentage of people in 1860 South states, and then only 10% of those had to pledge an oath of loyalty to the Union, and then that state would be brought back into the Union. His plan also called for granting suffrage, or the right to vote, to African Americans who were educated, who owned property, or who had served in the Union during the war. So one of the things we have to keep in mind about Abraham Lincoln, because there are a lot of misconceptions about Lincoln out there, is Lincoln did not believe that all African Americans and all former slaves should be granted equality. He did not believe in slavery, but that does not mean that he believed in equality. And so his plan was to give African Americans the right to vote. Now, this included not just former slaves, but other African Americans living in the North and the South that had not been allowed to vote prior to the Civil War, because most states did not allow African Americans to vote, even in the North, prior to the Civil War. But only those African Americans who were educated, who owned property, or who served in the Union during the war would be granted that right. So not a wholesale granting of the right to vote to all African Americans. So it's important to keep that in mind, because we have oftentimes this misconception about Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, and then we also tag him with being a believer in total equality, and that is a misconception. That is not factual. Abraham Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction will never come to fruition, because on April 14th, 1865, simply, about a week after Lee surrendered to Grant, officially ending the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a Southerner. John Wilkes Booth believed that by assassinating Lincoln, he would be helping the South. He believed that Lincoln was the reason that the South was suffering greatly at the time. And so Booth, one of those ironies of history, actually caused the South to suffer more with his assassination of Lincoln, because Lincoln's plan was very generous, and it would have ended Reconstruction much earlier than 12 years that we will see. Because after Lincoln is assassinated, his successor, Andrew Johnson, will not be able to get a lenient plan for Reconstruction passed through Congress, and he will fight with Congress the whole time that he is in the presidency. And many in the North, and especially in the Congress, felt that the South needed to be punished for the assassination of Lincoln, since Booth was a Southerner. And so Booth actually caused the South more problems with his act of violence than if he had let things alone. Did not play. Cancel. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, the vice president, will take over as president. Andrew Johnson was not a very popular vice president, and he will not be a very popular president. He was actually a Southerner. He was from Tennessee, but he did not believe in secession, and so he had become kind of a popular senator when Tennessee seceded from the Union. He refused to leave the Senate, saying that Tennessee had not left the Union. So in 1864, when Lincoln was running for re-election, he was actually up against General McClellan, and so he needed strong support throughout the country, and so he picked Johnson to be his vice president. So Johnson had only been vice president for about a year when Lincoln was assassinated. But he was never truly trusted by a lot of people in the North, because he was from Tennessee and he was a Southerner. When Johnson took over as the president, excuse me, Congress was not in session, but he believed that his role was to continue Abraham Lincoln's programs as much as possible. So he will keep Lincoln's cabinet, and he will put forth a plan for Reconstruction that is very similar to Lincoln's, but it is a little more punitive than Lincoln's plan. Under Johnson's plan for Reconstruction, leading Confederates would be disfranchised. And what they meant by leading Confederates was Confederates that owned property worth $10,000 or more. Now, when we look at $10,000 today, that's not a lot of money. But in 1865, $10,000 would be a lot of money. So if you owned property worth $10,000 or more, you would be considered a more wealthy individual in the South. And so those people, and only those people, would be disfranchised. What that meant was that they would lose their right to vote. They would lose their right to hold any political positions. All other Confederates, no matter what position they had held in the Confederacy, or if they had just been loyal to the Confederacy and not held any positions, all other Confederates would be allowed to vote, hold political office, just as if there had never been a war. Also under Johnson's plan, they had to, the South, the Southern states, had to repeal their ordinance of secession. Once again, this was something that we looked at on one of the early slides. Basically, the federal government wants the South to admit that secession is not right. That every time you don't get your way, you can't just quit and take your toys and go home. You can't leave the Union whenever you get mad. So they want them to repeal their ordinance of secession. That's a way of making the Southern states say, we should never have left the Union. They also want the Southern states to repudiate the Confederate debt in Johnson's plan. Repudiating the debt means that you're saying that the debt is not legal and it won't be paid. Now, we may look at that and think, well, hey, that's kind of a good thing. The South doesn't have to pay their debt. That's going to leave them with more money. But actually what it's doing is saying that if the debt is not legal, then the Confederacy itself was never legal. It's another way of making the Confederate States, the former Confederate States, say our government never legally existed. We never legally left the Union. It's also another way of saying that assuring that people won't loan those southern states money anymore. If you don't pay your debt back, people are not going to loan you money in the future. And then also, as a requirement to re-enter the Union, that southern state had to ratify the 13th Amendment. Now, according to the U.S. Constitution, only 3/4 of the states have to ratify an amendment before it becomes the law of the land, which is still a lot of states, 3/4 of the states, so it's an overwhelming majority. But as a condition for a southern state to re-enter the Union, that southern state had to ratify the 13th Amendment. So, for example, Texas. If Texas did everything else but didn't ratify the 13th Amendment, they still would not be allowed back in the Union. So a requirement was they had to ratify the 13th Amendment. This is a way of getting the southern states to say slavery is over, and we accept that slavery is over. And the last requirement of Johnson's plan was that a majority of eligible voters in 1860 had to pledge an oath of loyalty to the Union. So this is more than Lincoln required. Lincoln required only 10% of eligible voters. Johnson's plan is requiring a majority of eligible voters. But when we look at this plan in its totality, it's still not very punitive. Only a few people are losing their rights to vote. You're asking the states to admit that secession was wrong, and you're asking them to accept that slavery is over and then pledge to be loyal. It's not very punitive. So most of the southern states said, hey, this is a good plan. We agree to it. And so by January of 1866, most of the southern states, with the exception of just a couple, had ratified Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. Of course, one of those states that had not ratified Johnson's plan for Reconstruction was Texas, but Texas did adhere to all the requirements for Johnson's plan by the end of January 1866. So they just took them a little longer to come in. And so Johnson said, Reconstruction is over. The southern states have done what I asked them to do. Reconstruction is over. However, Congress came back into session, and Congress says, no, Reconstruction is not over. We did not approve this plan for Reconstruction, and so we think Reconstruction needs to continue. So this is when we begin the debate over who controls Reconstruction. Is it the president or is it Congress? We had never had this situation in American government before, and fortunately, we've never had it since, but it's going to be a huge issue for the next several years. Who's in charge? Is it the government? Is it Congress? Or is it the president? One of the reasons that Congress said that the South was not reconstructed is because the southern states had enacted black codes to restrict the rights of African Americans in their states. The black codes are state laws, so they vary from state to state, but they have some similarities in that they were all designed to restrict the rights of African Americans. Some of the things that we see in all of the black codes were that black African Americans were not allowed the right to vote. They were not allowed to serve on juries. Many of the states restricted African American rights to own firearms, so they were not granted rights under the Second Amendment. When we look at some of the more restrictive states, like Mississippi and South Carolina, which have very large African American populations, those states allowed corporal punishment in their states for African Americans. If an African American was working for you and they didn't do what you wanted, you could whip them just like the plantation owners have whipped their slaves. We also see that they often restricted the types of jobs that people could have. They could only hold positions like housekeepers and cooks and work in janitorial jobs or work as field hands on the plantations, basically keeping them to the same types of positions that they had before slavery. Some of the states also restricted African Americans' right to own property. So they were designed to basically create a second class of citizen, if you were. So Congress said, as long as these black codes are in place, the South isn't really changed. We've ended slavery, but we haven't really helped African Americans. So the congressional response to Johnson's plan of Reconstruction and the Black Codes was to create the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. A joint committee is basically a combined committee of members of the House of Representatives and members of the Senate. And they do this to try to get cohesion between the two houses of Congress. The Joint Committee of Reconstruction will ultimately take control of Reconstruction and lead Reconstruction. One of the first acts that the Joint Committee of Reconstruction did was it passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 granted citizenship for all former slaves and other black Americans. What we need to remember is that freed blacks before the Civil War in most states, even in the North, were not citizens. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 will grant them citizenship. The Civil Rights Act also stated that black citizens would have the same rights as any other citizen. So they're saying, they're kind of getting ahead of the South and saying, so you're going to have to give them equal citizenship rights. You can't say, okay, well, they're citizens, but we're going to have a Class A citizen and a Class B citizen. So black Americans will have the same rights as any other citizen. And the third thing that the Civil Rights Act did was stated that the black codes could not apply to American citizens. So it's taking the power away from the black codes. Now, President Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 because he said it was a violation of state rights, because up until this time, the states had defined who a citizen of their state was. And so for the first time, the federal government is trying to define citizenship. And Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But because of the leadership in the Joint Committee of Reconstruction, both houses of Congress were able to come together and they were able to override Johnson's veto. And basically, this is really the beginning of the end for Johnson. Because once Congress realizes that they have the power to override Johnson's veto, then they realize that they can take control of Reconstruction and they will initiate their own Reconstruction plan. The Congressional Plan for Reconstruction declared that in order to come back into the Union, the Southern states first had to repeal their black codes. Secondly, they had to rewrite their state constitutions, granting equal rights to all citizens except women and Indians. Women and Indians will still be considered second-class individuals until we get to the 20th century. Next, the Congressional Plan disqualified or disenfranchised all Southern whites who had participated in the Civil War on the part of the Confederacy. So everybody, regardless if he was a little private or a general, if they had participated in the Civil War on behalf of the Confederacy, he will lose his right to vote. He will lose his right to hold any political offices in the future. And fourthly, that's the states had to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments. What Congress has decided after the Black Codes is that we need to take further action to ensure equality in America. And so the 14th and the 15th Amendments will be written by Congress and sent out to the states for approval. The 14th Amendment is one of our longer amendments. It has 5 sections. I strongly encourage you to read it. It's in the back of your textbook in one of the appendixes. But the big thing is the first section of the 14th Amendment. The first section of the 14th Amendment says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. So let's look at that. If you're born here, you're a citizen. It doesn't say if you're born here and your parents are citizens, if you're born here and your parents were free. It's saying if you were born here, you're a citizen. So that would cover all the slaves who have been born in America. And at this time, that would mean everybody, because the importation of slaves from foreign countries have been illegal in the United States since 1808. The other way you can become a citizen is through naturalization, which is a process where foreigners can come in legally and go through a process where they meet certain requirements and they live here and they have jobs and they take a test, and then they can become a citizen of the United States. And so if you were born or naturalized, you are a citizen of the United States and the state wherein you reside. And so the 14th Amendment for the very first time gives us a federal definition of a U.S. citizen. It's not up to the states to decide. It is up to the national government, the federal government, to decide. That section also goes on to state that no state may abridge the rights of any of its citizens without due process of law. So the 14th Amendment is getting ahead of the southern states and trying to say that all of these people are citizens. They have the same rights as anybody else, and you cannot abridge those rights. When you go into the second section of the 14th Amendment, it says that any state that does abridge the rights of its citizens, denying, and it specifically talks about denying citizens the right to vote, and it says except Indians, will lose membership in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. So they're trying to discourage the southern states who still control who gets to vote from disfranchising Black Americans. And then the other sections go into more specific things about not paying the debt and those types of things. Then the 15th Amendment states that you may not deny the right to vote of any American citizen based on race, religion, or previous condition of servitude. So the 15th Amendment is guaranteeing male African Americans the right to vote. Now, it's important to recognize both the 14th and 15th Amendments apply to male citizens getting the right to vote, male citizens having equal rights. Women will not have those rights until the 20th century, and Native Americans, Indians, will not have those rights, the right to vote, until 1921. So these two amendments become a condition for rejoining the Union. We will see under the Congressional Plan of Reconstruction, most of the southern states refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. Initially, only Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment. And one of the reasons for this was because of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment declared that anyone that had fought on behalf of the Confederacy would lose their rights as citizens, including their right to vote and hold office. So you're basically asking people to vote for legislation that would deny them rights in the future. And so most southern states refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. Tennessee was the only southern state initially that ratified the 14th Amendment. Because the southern states refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, Congress will declare that Reconstruction must continue, and it will also give them an excuse to extend Reconstruction into what we call military Reconstruction. Military Reconstruction that begins after Congressional Reconstruction is unable to get the 14th and 15th Amendments passed, kept all of the provisions from the Congressional Plan, which we discussed on the previous slide. But in addition to that, they divided the South into 5 military districts, and there will be a military governor in charge in each one of those districts. So basically what they're doing is placing the South under military control, martial law. The idea is to force the South into ratifying the 14th and 15th Amendments. It is during military Reconstruction that we see the greatest criticism of Reconstruction, because during this time there was some instances of graft and corruption by these military governors. There were instances of, this is when the Ku Klux Klan will begin in the South, trying to maintain white power in the South. So there were some very negative things that did happen during military Reconstruction. However, there also are some very positive things that happened during military Reconstruction. There were a lot of state improvements during military Reconstruction. This is when new state constitutions are written, which give more rights to more people. While women don't gain the right to vote in these new Southern state constitutions, women did gain other rights in the South, like the right to own property that they did not have before. We will see that hospitals and schools and churches will be rebuilt during this time period. So there are a lot of very positive things to go along with some of those negative things that also happened during this era of Reconstruction. By 1868, 7 of your 10 Confederate states had completed the Congressional Plan for Reconstruction, and so they could elect congressmen to go to Washington to represent them. But we still don't say that Reconstruction officially ends until 1876 with that election. And that's because military Reconstruction will continue in those other 3 states. We will also see that the federal government will continue to interfere more in those Confederate states up until 1866, 1867. 1868 is also a presidential election year, but it is also the year that the radical Republicans in Congress decide they want to get rid of the president. They don't like Johnson. They have the power to override his veto, but it just costs them a lot of time, and they just want to get rid of it. Actually, they're really trying to show that they're more powerful than the president, really. So Congress will pass the Command of the Army Act, taking away the president's power as commander-in-chief of the Army. One of the things that Congress was afraid of was that if the president remained commander-in-chief of the Army, then he could end military Reconstruction at any time. So they passed that act to take that power away from him to ensure that they could keep Reconstruction going as long as they needed to. Another act that they passed was the Tenure of Office Act, which said that the president could not fire any officials without Senate approval. There was an underlying cause for Congress to pass the Tenure of Office Act. They wanted to protect Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War and who was a radical Republican. And they knew that he and Johnson did not get along, and they were afraid that Johnson was going to fire him. So they passed this act to protect Stanton, but also to ensure that if Johnson violated the act, then they could have cause for impeachment. President Johnson will fire Edwin Stanton, and when he fired Edwin Stanton, the House of Representatives will begin the impeachment process. I want to talk for a couple of minutes about the impeachment process because we misunderstand it, we misuse the word. Most of the time in America we say that he was impeached, meaning he was actually removed from office. And that is incorrect. We've actually never removed a president from office through impeachment. We've had several times when we've used impeachment, twice where it's gone through the entire course, a third time where the president resigned before it went through the whole course. But we've never actually removed a president from office through impeachment. The U.S. Constitution says in order to remove the president from office, that the president has to commit high crimes or misdemeanors. So that means he has to commit a crime. You can't just say we don't like this guy and remove him from office. He doesn't act presidential. We don't want him. We're going to remove him from office. We have elections every 4 years for that process. So the way it works is if a president is accused of a crime, the House of Representatives will look at the evidence. The House of Representatives will decide if they feel that a crime has been committed, and then they will bring charges up against the president. So the House of Representatives basically does what we would call in criminal court an indictment. They charge the president. In this case, Johnson was charged with 11 crimes. The main one being that he violated the Tenure of Office Act when he fired Edwin Stanton. Some of the other things were very petty. He was charged with using profanity in public. He was charged with public drunkenness. But they decided that there was enough evidence that they felt a crime had been committed, so he is indicted. He is charged with these 11 offenses. That's where the House's responsibility ends. If the House brings these charges up, then it goes to the Senate. The Senate is where it is decided if the president is guilty or not, and if he should be removed from office. When it goes to the Senate, you have a trial process just like you would in any other trial. You have defense attorneys, you have prosecuting attorneys who are presenting their evidence, and then the Senate acts as the jury. That's the difference in an impeachment trial and a regular trial. The Senate acts as the jury. It also takes 2/3 of the Senate to remove the president from office. So it's not just a simple majority, it takes 2/3. They want it to be not political, that he actually did something wrong to remove him from office. So the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson lasted for a couple of months, about 2.5 months really, during the spring of 1868. When the trial was finally over, after all of these weeks and weeks of presenting evidence, President Johnson was acquitted by 1 vote. That means that the radical Republicans lacked 1 vote in getting that 2/3 that they needed to remove the president from office. And the reason they did was because some moderate Republicans realized that this was pretty much just a railroad job, and they refused to vote to remove Johnson from office. So Johnson was able to stay in office. He was not removed from office, but he did go through the entire impeachment process. When we look at the impeachment of President Johnson, it is very important in our political history because the failure of the radicals to remove the president ensured that we would maintain a balance of power in our government. Johnson had not committed any crimes that were impeachable offenses. The Tenure of Office Act was later declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. Johnson's offense was that the radicals in Congress didn't like him. Well, that's not an impeachable offense. And so what we did by not removing Johnson was to assure that Congress did not get too powerful. When the Founding Fathers wrote our constitutions, they created 3 branches of government to ensure a balance of power. And Johnson being able to win through this impeachment process, not being removed from office, ensured that we would maintain that balance of power in our government, at least at this time.